So I do wonder how all those Texans down south would react to this story if they went to church this Sunday and happened to hear this story, and they hear Jesus' words to his disciples, to us in the middle of this storm. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Really, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid at this Hurricane Harvey that has just stalled over the mainland of Texas and has dumped up to potentially 30 inches, if not more, will dump more over this week. That has caused storm surges, perhaps over as tall as 12 feet high, water just gushing in on the mainland that has displaced thousands of people, leaving thousands of other people without power, and there's no really seeming end in sight, and it's going to cause even more catastrophic flooding. Really, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of that. How are you not supposed to be afraid of that, right? Is that what Jesus is saying here, though? Is Jesus saying that there is nothing in life that you should be scared of? There's nothing in life that you should be afraid of? Because experts would even say that fear in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. Fear can be a good thing. Fear is kind of the thing, the emotion that we experience. Our adrenaline starts surging through our bodies, and we get ready, our heart races, and it just prepares our body to keep us safe, to keep us from danger, to keep us from harm. Think of how foolish it would be for all those Texans to hear about this massive hurricane, Category 4, when it makes landfall, and they just say, I'm not scared. I'm not going anywhere. I mean, really, if you wanted to, you could say fear is what saved them. Fear is what got them out of Dodge and kept them alive. You could. And so, if fear is a natural, normal, and maybe some people might even say a necessary part of life, then you have to see Jesus isn't saying here in this story, he's not saying don't ever be scared of anything, but instead he's saying fear is not something you have to live in. That through him, there is a way you can walk through your storms and be freed from that trap of fear. And I want to show you how. I'm going to read again just the first few verses to set the scene and get us started. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Now later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Well, maybe storms used to frighten you once upon a time. Maybe they don't really frighten you anymore. But if you've ever been caught on a storm out in the middle of the lake, I assure you it's a quite different thing. Not from personal experience. I've been told, I've learned from people. Because being on land, experiences a storm, you can run, you can get out of the way, you can find shelter. Being in the middle of the sea, you're at the mercy of the waves. You're at the mercy of the wind. You're not in as much of control. It is a frightening thing. And that's exactly what it was for the disciples. No Jesus with them in the boat. It was late at night, probably around 3 a.m., the Greek kind of tells us. And Mark's gospel tells us about this same story, that at this point, the storm had been going on, the disciples had been struggling for hours at the oars, trying to keep the boat not just afloat, but also pointed in the right direction. The wind was blowing, the waves were splashing the boat and getting them wet with every single hit. The boat was moving up and down and side to side. It was a frightening time. And right in the middle of it, they look out and they see a figure on the water. But it's not another boat. It's a figure of a man. But he's not in the water. He's not swimming for his life. No one's yelling, man overboard. No, he's on the water, walking, and they're yelling, it's a ghost. It's a ghost. And they freak out. And I've always wondered if, after the fact, they thought how ridiculous they were. Because any 10-year-old can tell you there is no such thing as ghosts. They don't exist. The disciples knew that. Angels? Yes. Demons? Yes. Ghosts? No. There is no such thing as ghosts. So why do I bring this up? I bring this point up because the Bible brings it up, because this is really the first thing that we learn about fear. Fear so often leads us to irrational conclusions, like it's a ghost. If you let fear take you, it'll take you down a path where your imagination will just begin to ponder and think the most irrational things. And it's been doing this to us ever since we've been kids. Maybe you can remember when you were 5 years old, snuggled up in bed, warm and comfortable, and then you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear a noise in the room. And your heart rate starts to go and the adrenaline starts pumping in your veins, and you take that cover and you kind of put it over your head because you know what that noise means. That noise in your dark bedroom, it must be a monster. It must be something lurking under the bed, in the closet, waiting to get you, right? That's what we think when we're kids. Oh, I'm scared. There must be some bad, hideous thing just waiting to get me. And when you grow older, you realize that was ridiculous. There's no such thing as monsters. It's stuff for movies like Monsters, Inc. There's no such thing as that. But don't think for a moment that we grow out of this irrational conclusion that fear takes us to. Maybe there's some adults here who are scared of flying. You have a fear of flying. And I want to show you just how irrational that fear is. And if you are here and you do have a fear of flying, please, I'm not poking fun at you. I want to sympathize with you, but I also want to assure you how irrational that fear is. Your chances of dying in a car or in a plane crash are 1 in 11 million. That is a tiny, tiny chance. But we see it on the TVs, we see it in the Hollywood films, we think, oh my goodness, this is unsafe. I'll bet those same people who are afraid of flying have no problem getting in their cars, getting in their trucks, and driving to their destination. But do you realize your chances of dying in a car crash? 1 in 5,000. A significantly higher chance. In other words, you are more likely to die on your way to the airport than you are on the plane. Now, why do I bring this up? Here's the point that we need to talk about. If fear leads us to irrational conclusions in the world, then what do you think it will do with your relationship with God? When the storms of your life come your way and you freak out, how many times have you gotten mad and so angry at God? He's not being fair, but he's being unjust. How many times have you questioned his love, his care, maybe even his overall existence? Because you've said, well, if God says he's loving, if God says he's caring, he must not be. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be going through this storm in the first place. You see why we need to talk about this? Fear will lead you, if you let it, and if you live in it, to some irrational conclusions. And it will do detrimental things to your faith. But focusing your eyes of faith on God's promises has a way of driving out fear and freeing you from it. Just like it did for these disciples. Jesus immediately said to them, after they said, it's a ghost, what is this thing? Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. And Jesus sees his disciples petrified, freaking out, and he calls to them to calm them down. But I wonder how much of it was his words versus how much they were able to calm down by his presence on the water, walking on water. And have you ever wondered why he walked on the water? Like, if you wanted to calm your disciples' fears, he could have done so many things, right? He could have carved through the waves with more finesse and better form than Michael Phelps. And he could have landed in the boat and they could have said, wow, you just swam through a storm. We got nothing to be afraid of. He could have gone from the land to the boat and just teleported, just Just like that, just appeared right in the boat, and there he is and says, ta-da, guys, I'm here, got nothing to worry about. He could have flown like Superman through the air and then just kind of descended casually into the boat as the disciples are watching him, capturing their awe and attention while at the same time dispelling all their doubts, all their fears. But he walked on the water. Why? And some people who are way nerdier and way smarter than me have speculated on this question for a lot longer than I bet any of us have. And they've said, it may have something to do with how the first century people understood water and walking. Back in the first century, water was a very dangerous, uncertain, and mysterious thing, especially water on the open sea. Something like the Sea of Galilee, where storms can just appear out of nowhere, and before you know it, you're out there fishing, and the next thing you look up and you're caught in the middle of a storm, and without warning, you could be fighting for your life. It's very dangerous, a very uncertain place to be, but also it was very mysterious. And even on the clearest of days, if you've been out on any sort of lake, you realize you can only see maybe a foot, maybe 2 feet deep into the water, but that's it. What's down there? What mysterious creatures are waiting down there to get you? How deep does it go? It was an uncertain, dangerous, mysterious thing, and it became a metaphor in that first century for all the uncertainties, all the troubles, all the dangers in life. And then there's walking. Walking back in that first century was often used as a metaphor for a show of power. Rulers would talk about walking over their enemies. I'm going to tread on my foes because I'm more powerful, I'm mightier than they are. And so you put the two together, and do you see what we've got going on? Do you see what Jesus is doing? He's not doing a trick. He's sending a message. He's saying, I walk on top of and over all your uncertainties. I am stomping on what scares you. I am treading on your troubles. I walk and waltz all over your worries. I am the God that conquers and defeats all your uncertainties, all your worries, all your cares. That's the God who I am. I am bigger, I am more powerful than all those things. And that, friends, is the God that we put our faith in. That's the God that we focus our eyes of faith on. And that brings us really to our second point. You see, fear focuses you on the situation, but faith focuses on God's promises. See, when you focus on the situation, when you focus on the circumstances, you start to see the wind, you start to see the waves, you start to see the circumstances of your storm, and you freak out, and fear and doubt will pull you under and lead you to some really bad places that'll do really bad things to your faith. But faith focused on God's promises, in spite of the storm, in spite of the bad circumstances, will lead you to experience that storm in a profoundly different way. And I think all of you really know what I'm talking about. I want to take you back to when you were a kid again, when you were 5 years old, when you were young. Who was that person that you ran to when you were scared? Did you go to your mom and her soothing, tender, soft voice was able to just calm you down? Or maybe it was your dad, his strong embrace when you were in his arms, you knew you were safe. Who was it that you ran to, maybe an older sibling, maybe a mom, maybe a dad, maybe a friend, that as soon as they spoke, as soon as they held you close, you knew everything was going to be okay. Your fears, your anxieties, they just evaporated. Your heart rate slowed, and you knew everything was going to be all right, even though what's scaring you, what's freaking out hasn't changed. The circumstances, the situation hasn't changed. And however true that is for the person you're thinking of, it is infinitely truer when it comes to Jesus Christ. Because in your storms, when life throws a storm at your way, when you're in the middle of it, Jesus is crying out, don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here, and everything is going to be okay. And he can say that because he knows your fears. He knows them because he's experienced them to the deepest depth, to the highest magnitude. You think of what your greatest fear is. Maybe your greatest fear is being rejected. Being rejected by people you love. Jesus Christ on the cross was rejected by an entire world of people that he loved. Maybe your greatest fear is being alone. Jesus on the cross was utterly and hopelessly alone. Maybe your greatest fear is having nothing, losing everything. Jesus Christ on the cross lost all things and became nothing. Whatever your greatest fear is, Jesus knows it because he experienced it to the greatest degree. And those fears, it took him under. And they killed him. But then 3 days later, he wasn't just a victim of his fears. 3 days later, he rose as victor over those fears as he walked out of that tomb, confidently treading over all your fears, over all your sins, just as he promised he would. And that's how you can walk through your storms. By focusing on his promise, by focusing on his promises that he's made in spite of your circumstances, just like the disciples did, just like Peter did. Right? Peter, he hears Jesus say, "Come." He hears this promise from Jesus. Jesus promises him he can come out to him. He says, "Come." And Peter, he takes his focus off the wind, off the waves. He puts them on Jesus. And he takes a leap of faith overboard, and he lands on the water. And he starts walking towards Jesus on the water. Because he took his eyes and put them on, his eyes of faith and put them on God's promises. So what are you going to do then? Are you going to focus on God's promises? Or are you going to put your attention on the wind and the waves of your storm? The name Louis Zamperini might ring a bell with some of you if you like reading some interesting war stories. He's a World War II veteran, recently died in 2014, but his survival story has been published in many novels, and they even made a Hollywood blockbuster film, Unbroken. Maybe you've heard of that. If not, go check it out afterwards. He was part of a crew that manned a B-24 bomber stationed out in the Pacific Ocean, and one day his mission was to go on a rescue mission, look for this lost signal from another ship that was out at sea. And so as they're out there, suddenly his B-24 bomber malfunctions, loses all engine power, and they crash land in the middle of the Pacific, and for 46 days, he survives the open sea, the open ocean, hundreds of miles away from land. And he says one of the greatest temptations when you're out there at sea with next to no supplies is to think that you can drink the water. That you can drink all of that water around you and be okay. He says when you think you're going to die, when you're scared, you think, your brain knows salt water is bad, salt water will dehydrate me and kill me faster, but you think, I can beat the odds. I can be the exception to that. And I can live off of that, right? Fear leads to some irrational conclusions, doesn't it? But you can't. And you drink that salt water, it will kill you. And here's the point. You cannot drink the water that causes the waves. You can't drink the water, friends, that causes the waves in your storms. We are a nation that is so politically divided right now. People have lost friends over this last election. And not just that, we're facing violence in our own country, hate in our own country. We're facing threats of terrorism as well as threats from other countries. And while it's a good thing to be informed, to listen to the news, to inform yourself as a good, godly Christian citizen. It is an entirely different thing to set aside Jesus' promises that he's ruling over the world and to drink in 24 hours every single day all of the news feed, listening to Fox News all the time, listening to CNN and NBC, and drink that in and think the world's going to end, America is going to go down the toilet any day now. You know what you're doing? You are drinking the water that causes the waves. When there's a friend in your life who is causing a bunch of drama, and instead of taking it to Jesus, instead of taking your problems at his cross and laying him there, you instead go and talk to everyone else about it, and you let it consume you, and you let it take over, and before you know it, this drama has been the thing that's taking center focus in your life, and you're wondering why it's not getting any better. You are drinking the water that causes the waves. When you sit there and you think about your bank account and you think and talk all the time how I don't have any money, and then you hear God's promises that says you have a heavenly Father who will provide for you, and you think that's too naive, that's too simplistic. No, and you set that aside and you complain instead of seeking help about your finances, and every bill you stress over. You are drinking the water that causes the waves, and it will kill your faith. Just as it did to Peter. He's walking on the water. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand, caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." It's amazing. Peter had faith in Jesus' promise. He takes some steps, walks out on the water to Jesus, but then the wind catches his cloak, and he realizes how violent the wind is, and he gets some overspray splashed into his face from a wave, and then he sees another big one coming after him, and before you know it, he is drinking the water that causes the waves, literally, and he's sinking. And why? He was just walking. Why is he sinking? Because he takes his eyes off of Jesus, and he puts them on the circumstances of his storm. And he lets fear and doubt creep in and pull him under. And he cries out in desperation, "Lord, save me." And Jesus didn't hesitate. He reaches in, he pulls up Peter, carries him to the boat, and says, "Why? Why'd you doubt?" He had no reason to doubt. My goodness, besides Jesus, Peter did one of the coolest things you could think of in the Bible. He walked on water, something that no human being has ever done before. He walked on water. Why did he have any reason to doubt? It's just because he started to concern himself more with the circumstances rather than the promises. And fear and doubt came in. So I'll ask you again, what are you going to do? If there's anything this lesson teaches us, it teaches us that in the middle of your storms, you can do one of two things. You can walk through your storm. You can walk through your storms by focusing on Jesus' promises, his loving, caring promises that he is not going to abandon you. He is going to be there for you. In spite of your circumstances, in spite of the howling wind and the surging waves of your storm, you can hold on to those promises and experience that storm in a profoundly different way, with a profound sense of peace and calm and tranquility. Or you can do what most people do. You can focus on the waves and the wind. You can focus on how bad the storm is, and you can take your eyes off of Jesus' promises, and you can let fear and doubt creep in and pull you under and consume you and frustrate you. And some of you may be feeling guilty because that's where you are. You were mad at God, questioned his love. Where are you? And I want to assure you of something. The reality. It's so beautiful. If that's where you are, if you're drowning, know that Jesus is standing right next to you. He's standing on top of all of your troubles, waiting for you to just reach out in faith so that he can grab you and pull you up from underneath all your worries And so you can believe in his promises in spite of the storm and walk together with him through your storms. Take courage. And don't be afraid. Because he is walking on your worries, stomping on what scares you, and treading on all of your troubles. Take courage. Amen.